It's the week ending Saturday the 25th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Speaker Lindsay Hoyle apologising after a chaotic Gaza debate in the Commons, Lord Cameron using the M-word, murder, as he confronted Russia's foreign minister over the death of Alexei Navalny, and Oppenheimer sweeping the board at the BAFTAs. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, we have Harriet Marsden. From the Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcast, it's Cindy Yu. And let's spin the globe to Sydney, Australia, and say g'day, mate, to Arion McNicoll. Cindy, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Well, Ollie, becoming the leader of the free world might have just got a bit more challenging.
Her name is Amelia. She wants to know where my granddaughters are. One granddaughter lives in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. One granddaughter lives in New York. One granddaughter lives in Washington. One granddaughter lives in Wilmington, Delaware. And the other grandsons, my grandson lives in California. I left somebody out, didn't I? Anyway, I did say 5, you're right.
President Biden struggling to remember how many grandchildren he has at a kids' event at the White House last year. Now, Cindy, the president's dodgy memory seems rarely out of the headlines at the moment. So what's happened this week that we've missed?
So what's happened this week is that the daughter of Ronald Reagan, former president, she's 71 herself, Patty Davis. She's actually said that presidents should get cognitive testing above a certain age threshold. And now she has personal reasons for saying this. Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with dementia 5 years after leaving the White House, and he died 10 years after that. And there are signs, and some family members have said basically that he had, early signs of dementia, even when he was running for his second term as president. And obviously now Patty Davis coming out and saying this, she's not an active political player, but obviously someone who can see how, the tolls of the job in the White House, as well as what that does to an aging leader.
And she's not just saying this apropos of nothing, is she? I mean, when Reagan left office, he was younger than both Biden and Trump are now. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So Reagan had been the oldest president ever when he came into office, but now we're looking at, obviously the nominations haven't been decided yet, but most likely it will be Biden versus Trump. Biden's 81, Trump is 77, a sprightly 4 years younger than Biden. But obviously the clip we heard there was Biden, but Trump has also showed signs of gaffes over his time on the campaign trail. Slightly harder to tell when he's just been Trump and when they're related to any declining cognitive abilities. But, it's just an interesting thought, basically. In some professions, in some countries, there is cognitive testing for age-related things. In medicine, in some parts of the US, in piloting, for example, you have to go through these tests just to make sure you're still fit. And I don't think it should be offensive to say that actually, medically speaking, people's cognitive abilities can decline very quickly after the age of 70.
It may not be offensive, Arion, but it just might not be a practical suggestion to actually put this in place, given that America has not only elderly presidential candidates, as we've been discussing, but also geriatric senators and congressmen. There's no one in power who'd actually put this in place, is there?
I think that's right. I mean, Congress is famously at one of its all-time oldest eras. So there's a lot of people, not just the president, but people within Congress who are also well into their 60s, 70s and 80s. But the thing is, it sort of depends on the individual. And I think this is one of the big questions around, whether the suggestion being put forward by Ronald Reagan's daughter, Patty Davis, is even practical. well, what sort of a test would this be and what would it look like? How do you test people? And people, in any case, age differently from one another, particularly mentally. Reagan himself used to make a joke of it. At a debate in 1984, the moderator reminded Reagan that he was already the oldest president in history. And Reagan, who was 73 at the time, responded, "I want you to know that I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience." And even his Democratic opponent, Walter Mondale, laughed at that line. And Biden tries to do the same thing. At a Black History Month event last February, he told the crowds, "I look back on my career of 280 years, etc., etc." But this is the thing, that the president sort of faces this increasing scrutiny, particularly following a special counsel's report about his mishandling of classified documents earlier this month that raised questions about his memory. The special counsel said that if he went on trial, Biden would basically be able to argue that he was potentially a kindly sort of elderly man with a poor memory, and if he took a line like that, then no jury would convict. And opinion polls, do consistently show that American voters don't believe that Biden is mentally or physically fit to serve a full second term. But quite a lot of the criticisms of him that are being raised about his stumbles as evidence of his sort of deterioration into dementia could be connected, some experts have suggested, to the fact that he has a stutter. Not all of them, but some of them could be. So I think there's a lot of things going on here.
Yeah, but it's the fact that those stumbles are so actively discussed, isn't it, Harriet? That's what's different to in Reagan's era. Partly, I guess, just because of the media landscape we're in, and not every single thing was analysed in that way back in the 1980s. But I got the sense that whatever you thought of Reagan's politics, people always thought that he was a slick operator, that he could deliver a line, like Arion just suggested, that was funny and looked like he'd intended to say it. What you've got with Biden is a distinct feeling of discomfort when you're watching him. Like, you don't just trust that what he's saying is what his brain wants to say.
Yeah, but I do think it's worth saying that we're in a completely different political landscape now, and the American public are facing a completely different choice of politician now. I think that we have to be extraordinarily careful when we discuss this, because there has been a lot of criticism about how, in particular, the New York Times has, some have said, excessively covered these issues with Biden's age and mental acuity and verbal gaffes and physical stumbles, when actually Trump has made just as many gaffes, if not more. As Cindy was saying, a lot of people seem to dismiss these things as, oh, it's Trump, it's just Trump, he's probably lying, he probably hasn't a clue, he probably doesn't know who the president of Mexico or Egypt is, so it doesn't matter if he got them confused or not. So there have been accusations of hypocrisy in focusing excessively on Biden's age, when Trump, who, as Arion said, is only 3 years younger, is consistently mistaken who the president is, which is, by the way, if you were going to have a cognitive test, that would be the first question you were asked in an emergency room or a neurological office. Who is the president of the United States? Obviously, Trump famously refused to accept that he had lost the presidency, but since then, and very recently, he has actually seemed to imply that Barack Obama is still president. I mean, that is something that I think that in this focus on Biden and his gaffes and his physical gait and his age, I think that it runs the danger of muddying the waters of what is actually a very binary choice between two aging men, one of whom is a convicted felon, indicted felon, is guilty of sexual abuse. We're talking about mishandling of documents. We all remember the photos of those that bathroom with the documents just piled left, right, and center. There's special classified documents all over the place. I think that we have to be extraordinarily careful how we talk about this. America is facing probably the greatest threat to its democracy, or if not the greatest threat to democracy it has ever and probably will ever face.
And yet, Cindy, the Republicans and the Democrats are choosing these candidates. There is a process in place. They could have gone for Nikki Haley, couldn't they? They could have gone for Ron DeSantis. I know technically they still could go for Nikki Haley. It's very unlikely. So why? Why are they selecting these older candidates?
Yeah, I mean, this is the really interesting question, Ollie. And I've read some, thoughtful articles on it, but it doesn't seem like anyone really has a persuasive answer for it. Some people say that America is aging. So obviously candidates are going to get older when society's getting older. But when you look across the world, all countries pretty much are aging in the developed world. And yet, for example, in the UK, our prime ministers seem to be getting younger and younger. So why is that not being reflected? So I don't know if that is really the explanation. There's this argument that voters like to see experience, not necessarily political experience, as Trump's success has shown, but just experience. This is kind of like a known brand kind of, a known quantity kind of thing, where Joe Biden and Donald Trump both have so many decades of, public profile. And then the other thing that an aging society could contribute to was also that this idea that voters might vote for more people that look like them as well. So older voters disproportionately vote and participate in politics, in democratic politics across countries. And so perhaps they're voting for people who they think would represent their interests more, or just talk in more of their ways, or care about the issues that they care about. But all of that will have impact as well on the politics that comes out. For example, issues that matter to young people might not be so much talked about or cared about. In the UK, again, as an example, we do have this whole huge argument about the pensions triple lock, where it does seem like older people are getting quite a good deal, when at the same time there's a housing crisis, and frankly none of the politicians are living in rented properties, really. So there are all sorts of questions about what happens when politics stops being representative in certain ways.
But then I suppose you have the question as well, Arion, about the team that are around the president, right? And this is something that maybe the Democrats could lean into as the election approaches, which is that on the surface of it anyway, it appears to me that the Democrats have a younger team around Joe Biden than the Republicans do around Donald Trump. So actually, yes, the figurehead might be older, but they're surrounded by younger people with different experiences.
I mean, I think that's definitely an argument that could be made, and you have to look at the complexion of politics as a whole and a party as a whole, because they're going to be made up of people of all sorts of different ages. And there are at last signs of the erosion of the so-called grey wall in the US. Last year, Patrick Leahy, who was 82, a Democrat from Vermont, stepped down after 48 years in the Senate. Another senator, Dianne Feinstein of California, also announced her retirement at 89. Simultaneously, you had the arrival of Maxwell Frost, who's a 26-year-old who is being hailed as the first Generation Z congressman. And the last time we were talking about age on this podcast, we were talking about the election of Keir Mather at the age of 25 over here in the UK, and Charlotte Owen, who became the youngest ever peer at the age of 30. And the question we were discussing then was, are these people too young for politics? And now we seem to be talking about whether people are too old for politics. Is there just this sort of happy midpoint where people are at their political best? Or, as I suppose you're suggesting with your question, can it be that teams of people representing a span of different age groups can work in conjunction to, have the interests of, the entire age range of a population in mind when they're considering different kinds of legislation and actions? And I think that probably is how politics is best served. And yes, we've hit this rare moment where you've got these two comparatively older men who are in line for the presidency, most likely, but, it's not as if that's going to be the case forever. And Barack Obama, for example, was famously young when he ran to be president not so very long ago.
I mean, also, if you have cognitive tests for president hopefuls, Harriet, then surely you need to start introducing cognitive tests or IQ tests for all kinds of jobs and professions. I mean, we have an ideal candidate for all kinds of things around us, and yet that would be seen as discriminatory.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't want to kind of go down the whole slide of whataboutery here, but it is true that there are very dangerous implications with regards to people's physical abilities, with regards to also who would be delivering the cognitive tests, who would be delivering the mental fitness
we want
tests.
the president to be physically robust to put in long days so we can't have one in a wheelchair again, right?
Exactly. You can see where it goes off on all sorts of different, very dangerous tangents, and particularly mental health tangents as well. I mean, there have been an extraordinary amount, very unprecedented amount of psychologists, psychiatrists, and health specialists who have questioned Trump's mental fitness to be president for other reasons, like claiming that he suffers from severe psychiatric disorders, that he is unhinged, unbalanced, which, by the way, I would say is much more dangerous than a poor memory or verbal lapses. You know, it's a lot of people, you can see where it would be very difficult to legislate around. But I think it's worth noting as well that, you know, we talk about why America is such a gerontocracy, but it's not the only one. I mean, we've spoken on this podcast before about Africa. If you're saying that it's reflective of the median age of the population in Africa, as we've talked, the median age of leaders is 63, where the population is 19. The median age of the population is 19 years old, being led by 63-year-olds. And in India, where the median age is 28, Narendra Modi is 73. You know, China also has the same median age as the US, and Xi Jinping is 70. So it's also, I think we have to look at other aspects of this, which are to do with money and are to do with corruption of the democratic system. To run for president of the US or to become a leader of most African nations takes an extraordinary level of money and power and connection that takes a very long time to accumulate. So it's a much bigger problem than just whether people respond well to experience.
And putting stipulations on it, Cindy, is that fundamentally anti-democratic anyway? There's a process, people can see the candidates, they can choose who they want, and faults come into it. I mean, there were critics of George W. Bush in his time that said he didn't have the IQ to be up for being president. But again, that was people's choice.
Yes, to be clear, I don't think we should get IQ testing for politicians. That would go down a very bad route. No, I think the problem is that the Biden team, and I hear what Harriet's saying, that Trump has made his gaffes, but I do think that Biden seems to be making more mistakes than Trump does. And I think the problem is that the Biden team seems to be protecting him from protecting the public from being able to see exactly what kind of mistakes he might be making. For example, he's always been mocked for the schedule, even when he's in the White House, of starting at 9:30, which to us probably sounds normal, but as I understand it, for presidential schedules, that's actually quite late. And there are rumors that they do that because of his age. That he has repeatedly claimed that the US would come to the defense of Taiwan in the instance of a Taiwanese invasion by China. Even though that is not the US position, he has had to be rowed back by his team. And so what I'm worried about, Ollie, is that actually voters don't know what they're voting for because they don't get that much access to the person on top. And of course, these teams and advisors are very important too. But at the end of the day, there's only one commander-in-chief. And so I'd rather they were off sound mental acuity than, because they have the powers to start wars, to kill people, to create huge international unrest. And so I want it to be someone who knows kind of relatively what they're doing, even if you might disagree with what they're doing, as in the case of Trump for many people. So I think that for me is the greater question here. I don't think that cognitive testing should be placed for anyone, or maybe even for the White House, but it is such an important role. It might be the most important job in the world. So I think it's not asking too much for the people in that role to at least know what they're doing or remember where the last country they went to was and how many grandchildren they have.
And can we all agree that the correct age for the presenter of a current affairs podcast is 42? Arion, you're up next after this. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, Sydney residents were advised not to breathe in too deeply in the lungs of the city.
There's kids playing here near the playground, people walking with their dogs, so it's really upsetting to think that we might be exposed to asbestos.
A lot of the places where the asbestos is dumped is not places you walk on anyway.
Is it overkill? I don't know.
Some Sydney locals speaking to ABC News on Tuesday. Arion, what were they talking about?
Yeah, so Sydney is currently in the grips of a massive asbestos crisis, which started in early January when asbestos was found in an inner city park. But this week it's escalated significantly because pieces of loose asbestos have been found in more locations all across the city, including supermarkets, hospitals, housing estates and train stations, and even a few schools which have been forced to close while the problem is resolved.
Okay, hold on. Just take us back a bit, because you said some asbestos was found in a park, like that's a normal thing. So what was that story?
Oh, it's terrible. So the story began sort of innocently enough when this child brought home a couple of handfuls of garden mulch from nearby a playground in a new park in Sydney's inner west. And one of the child's parents, who was a tradesperson who knows about this kind of thing, was horrified that the mulch contained chunks of what he recognised as bonded asbestos. And this story is literally quite close to home for me because I've just moved back to Sydney, as you mentioned, and I happen to be living pretty much at ground zero of this whole issue. And the parks around my house now look like a kind of crime scene with fencing and tape everywhere, which both, sucks for my kids because they can't play, but it's also worrying for their health too, given that they've been playing with this stuff. But I think the whole thing speaks to the ongoing of asbestos, not only in Australia, but globally. It continues to be made and sold as a commercial product, and even in the 70 countries where it already has been banned, it's an ongoing cause of both health problems and deaths.
Yeah, Harriet, can you just outline those for us? What are the health concerns of asbestos?
Well, asbestos is mainly linked with respiratory issues, particularly lung cancer and an incredibly rare, deadly type of cancer called mesothelioma. And what I found so kind of terrifying about this story is that I knew that asbestos had been banned in building and construction in the UK since 1999. What I didn't know was that they believe that there is still asbestos in materials in 300,000 non-domestic buildings in the UK. And mostly being at risk are schools and hospitals. And obviously the risk, because it's inside the building materials, the risk is that you could disturb it when you're renovating or maintaining a building, demolishing it, or particularly in the news at the moment, retrofitting buildings for net zero purposes. And I was absolutely astonished also to discover that asbestos related illnesses is the biggest workplace killer in the UK. It kills about 5,000 people a year, mostly via this very, very deadly cancer, mesothelioma. I just sort of was also astonished and stunned and slightly horrified to discover that just last September, the UK government rejected a proposal from more than 10,000 people, petition from more than 10,000 people. And I know you and I have spoken in the past about how useless I think petitions are, but the government rejected a petition from more than 10,000 people asking for them to commit to removing all this asbestos over the next 40 years and for a register so people would know which buildings in the UK they believed contains asbestos. The government rejected that. There's two very reasonable sounding proposals, both of which were kind of suggested by a workplace and pensions committee. So effectively a government body after significant research and consultation. So this is, I'm horrified that this is kind of coming up right next to Arion's home, but here in the UK as well, like people should know that they could at any point be in a building that contains asbestos related materials and be at risk.
Well, they should know, yes, Cindy, and knowledge is power, and it might be that there are people out there who are like, I don't want my children going to a school that's got asbestos in the roof because of the chance it might be disturbed, because, I know someone who died from this particular poisoning or whatever. But knowing is not the same as being at risk. And, it is worth saying, isn't it, that the reason that those things haven't been activated is because the general feeling in the UK is you're not at risk if it is disposed of correctly when you refurbish a building.
Yeah, exactly. So you could be renovating a building, in which case you should be getting someone proper to kind of survey your building and understand the risks of disturbing that and properly get people out so that they could remove it safely. Or I guess it could be some kind of accident where, your roof falls down or there's an explosion or whatever it is. But in those cases, they're still relatively rare. And so the idea of the government going to remove this extent of asbestos, I think creates more problems if it was actually implemented because of the risk. It literally
creates more dust for people to breathe in.
Exactly, because of the risk of implementing it badly. And let's be clear now, I know we've had 14 years of Tory government. The government's track record on this kind of project has not been incredibly inspiring, I would say. So I'd rather probably they don't touch it. And then for us to have enough regulations such that when it has to be touched, the renovations and so on, it can be done properly. And it was interesting that in this Australian case, one of the staffers who used to work at one of the watchdogs said that actually Australian government did know about some of this possibility of contamination as long ago as 10 years ago, that he had authored a report saying that because of certain loopholes in the regulation, waste from demolition sites could be used in public parks in the way that it has been discovered. And so now that I think, and Arion will be able to say a bit more about this, there's a kind of questions being asked in terms of what was known when, what could have been prevented, given loopholes in the regulation for certain building materials.
Yeah, was this basically a failure politically, Arion, or did a construction site go rogue? Or, I mean, how does asbestos waste end up in a children's playground?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things going on here. So Australia had one of the world's highest per capita asbestos consumption rates in the 1950s, primarily from mining, but also the use of asbestos in construction materials, the way that it's used worldwide. But finally, Australia woke up to the whole issue and banned asbestos a bit after the UK, actually, in 2003. But obviously, there's still a lot of it kicking around the country. And in fact, it's been estimated that asbestos is now in 1 in every 3 homes in Australia. And while demolition companies are required by law to deal with asbestos properly when they're called on to actually bring a building down, in practice, doing so is quite expensive. And, you have to get in specialists to do the work. And so instead, a lot of them might just not find the asbestos during the whole process of surveying the building before they knock it down. And meanwhile, the New South Wales EPA, the Environmental Protection Authority, encourages people renovating and businesses who are knocking down buildings to reuse their building waste when they can, so that it doesn't just go into landfill. So you end up with a lot of asbestos that we could have prevented being sort of used in these different ways in construction materials, like the mulch that has started to end up in parks. You could avoid that whole issue, but unfortunately there's so many issues quite aside from the fact that, as Cindy was saying, the regulation wasn't put in place properly, but also even if it had been, you can imagine that lots of companies just simply wouldn't do what they were meant to, and certainly we've already seen that they haven't been adhering to the standards that even do exist. But the finger is being pointed at one company in particular called Green Life Resource Recovery, and that company has now been banned from distributing any more of the mulch that it has in its facilities, but it's saying it has nothing to do with us. We've tested all our mulch. There's no asbestos in it. It must be being introduced even further down the sort of the line between our distribution points and the parks. Someone has put it in and it's got nothing to do with us. So it's really a head scratcher. People don't yet know where it's coming from, and I think that is part of the concern.
And the problem is, Harriet, very typically it'll be 2 decades before someone actually has symptoms as a result of breathing in asbestos. So when it comes to finger pointing, even if you do find whose fault it was, that might be a company that doesn't exist anymore, or, a chairman who made that decision who's now died or retired. It's quite difficult to hold someone accountable for something they did that long ago anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, the legality of the situation in the UK is that whoever owns the building is responsible for protecting its users from asbestos-related conditions. So it's a slightly different legal landscape in the UK. But to Cindy's point about after 14 years of Tory government, we can't actually trust them to dispose of any of this adequately. Yeah, absolutely. But our policy can't just be to not leave dangerous stuff in all these hospitals and schools and 5,000 people dying horribly. And that doesn't include all the people that survive these cancers, but 5,000 people dying horribly from asbestos related conditions. We can't just leave it because we don't trust our government to deal with it competently. That can't be.
But if you leave it, that's when it's not dangerous, right? When you disturb it, that's when it's dangerous, as you've said.
Well, not necessarily, because a lot of it will also be basic maintenance as well that actually legally has to be done. So it's not just when you demolish the buildings. People are exposed to it, can be exposed to it at any given time when necessary. Storm damage, for example, would be a big one when you're fixing that. And as we saw last year with the scandal of the aerated concrete, with 100 schools suddenly had to close because the government accepted that a 30-year lifespan of concrete was therefore not good enough, and all these schools now at risk of collapsing at any time. I mean, I feel like we've sort of stopped talking about this, but it's a similar situation that our current policy, which is to maintain in situ as opposed to actively try and deal with it, it's that can't last forever. That's a time-limited policy. Eventually, there will come a point, like the Times has had this campaign called Act Now on Asbestos, because it's raising concerns about the exposure of teachers and children in schools to asbestos. It can't last forever, this policy. I mean, it's just kicking it down the long grass. Like, what's it going to take? Is it going to take children dying of mesothelioma, or is it going to take teachers refusing to go into schools because either the roof's going to collapse or they're going to get lung cancer?
Well, also, it's worth talking about the rest of the world, isn't it? I mean, Cindy, India is the biggest user of asbestos. Actually, regardless of what we do in the UK or what they do in Australia, in developing countries like India, I can imagine it being very difficult to, put in an environmental regulation for people's health when it's a cheap material you can build things from.
It's a cheap material, it's reliable. Its capability for insulation is also apparently miraculous. So that's why it's been used for over 100 years now. And actually, it's incredible, to Harriet's point of kicking the can down the road. The earliest documented reports of asbestos harm was actually in the 1900s, like in the early 1900s. So that's only a few decades after it starts being used and people knew about it. And yet we've gone through a whole century of it being widely used in all sorts of countries. In Australia, it wasn't more popular until the 1940s to the 80s. And so for developing countries, you can see why they need it. They do need it. What would you... there are certain concerns, I think, that countries have at different stages of development. But if you need the buildings, if you need the schools now because you're a growing country, that comes first. And then later on comes concerns about health. And that's the trajectory we've seen a lot of countries going on. And Olly, as you know, I know more about China. And what's interesting is that China has actually been one of the biggest consumers of asbestos since the 20th century, when the economic miracle took off in the 1980s and it had to build all of these new homes, houses, hospitals, schools, whatever you name it. But actually, in the last 10 years, there's been a 40% reduction in the asbestos used. And I like to think, in my perhaps slightly Panglossian view, optimistic view of development, when countries become slightly more rich, when they become a bit more developed, when people care more about conservation issues, health issues, than they do about literally getting enough food and clothes on their backs, that they start caring about these issues. And that China's trajectory in the last 10 years is an optimistic sign of where India could go, of where Russia could go, of where Brazil could go, all these other big consumers of asbestos as well. And also indeed where, developed countries like Australia and the UK have been as well. And so, yeah, I'm relatively optimistic about it, but it's true, it is still used way more than it should be for comfort internationally.
In the meantime, Arion, as a result of this increased awareness of asbestos around where you are, have you got any better at being able to spot where there is some?
Well, I don't know what it looks like, unfortunately, but I can certainly spot the big warning signs saying danger asbestos. So fortunately, my children are safe in that respect.
And another reason to tell your children when they go to the park, do not eat the mulch. Okay, Harriet, you're up next after this. Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are the British totally trolleyed?
Don't drink too much, okay? Don't drink too much. You may get drunk. If you get drunk, that's bad. If you're posh, of course, you have a variety of options. You can be trousered, or trolleyed, or wellied, or rat-arsed. You can actually use any word in the English language and substitute it to mean drunk as a posh person, and it still sounds acceptable. Did you have a drink last night? Are you joking? I got utterly gazeboed. It fits. Angus, you're driving. I'm car parked. It's all right. Slow down, chaps. I'm pyjamaed.
Michael McIntyre on the BBC's Live at the Apollo back in 2008. An iconic routine in the McIntyre Irv, Harriet, and back in the news this week.
Yeah, so this very well remembered and somewhat iconic Michael McIntyre sketch turned up in a very unlikely place this week, in a study published in a linguistics journal from a university in Germany that was basically investigating this claim. The study found that the English language had at least 546 words to mean drunk. But also, like Michael McIntyre was suggesting, it found that thanks to the British flexible grammar and sense of humour and also culture of intense drinking, most adults would understand any combination of I was like totally, utterly, completely, and then a past participle. So I was totally trolleyed, pajamaed, gazeboed, I was utterly battered. Most adults would understand that to mean drunk, even if it wasn't an actual word to mean drunk.
Let's just pause you right there. Cindy, do you have a favourite from the survey?
I quite like car parked. I've never heard that one before, but I can imagine it.
Arion?
Yeah, rat-assed was pretty solid. I think that's hard to go past.
I mean, it's amazing how many of these you do encounter just in general conversation with the Brits, Harriet. I mean, in McIntyre's routine there, he's talking about posh people, but actually people of all walks of life will say pissed, wankered, mullered. These are common phrases, and actually it's true, isn't it? It's not at all an obstacle to explain what you're talking about. Why do we have so many euphemisms for drunk then?
Well, the study author believes that the reason that we have all these words is a combination of we have a very flexible sentence structure. She does say it wouldn't work in German because it's very set syntax. And we also culturally very much enjoy what she called witty wordplay. But as you say, I mean, there's also a great influence here of Cockney rhyming slang, which the study looked into as well, which includes sort of saying Brahms for Brahms and Liszt, or pissed, and Schindler's, you know, for Schindler's List and pissed. It's
I haven't heard that one in real life.
These drunkonyms, it's a great word, drunkonym. I absolutely love it. It's synonyms for words that mean drunk. They could just go back hundreds of years. I mean, the study found that we were using these back, like, first usages we're finding in 1400s, in the 16th century. A lot of these words have a real lengthy history in British literature as well.
Is that a problem, Cindy, for people coming to Britain who maybe don't have drinking as such a fundamental part of their culture, that we have 500 words for drinking?
Yeah, I think it can be confusing. I'm not sure about the vocab specifically, but all cultures have some kind of drinking trait or drinking tradition in their culture. But the British drinking culture is pretty, I think, exceptional. You know, I don't think that's in a bad way. But the fact that people, you know, in December or February will stand outside on the pavement and hold their pints shivering in the rain to drink without eating anything, I think it would just be considered absolutely psychotic by most of the world. And I know this because in China, for example, when you're drinking, and there's a lot of drinkers, but you drink with a meal. You drink when you're eating. You would never just drink to drink, and you would never also be standing up to drink just outside a pub. So that pub culture, I think, is exceptional. And for Chinese students coming to the UK on a university experience, they do find that quite difficult to integrate into because they don't understand it. It's not something that they enjoy. It's not something they've ever come across. And if they say, well, why don't we go for a meal and a beer instead? People here are like, but we'll just be at the pub. Why do we even need to eat?
But it's also about drinking to excess, isn't it, Arion? All those words are about drinking to the point at which you're vaguely incapacitated. Again, that's something that's, you know, maybe difficult to get your head around, that as a nation we're saying essentially this is really funny, this idea that, you know, you're not safe as a person anymore because you've had so much liquor.
Yeah, I mean, the slightly amusing thing about it is that it all feels a bit Spock from Star Trek, that a German was trying to unpack and understand the silly English humour surrounding the words meaning drunk. But yeah, the woman behind the research, Professor Christina Sanchez-Stockhammer of Chemnitz University of Technology in Germany.
I mean, you can do your own joke about whether Stockhammered sounds like a drinking name.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Stockhammered the other night.
But she was putting together exactly these two things that both Harriet and Cindy are talking about, both the British sort of absurdist sense of humour and also some of Britain's drinking habits, some of which are negative. And the study actually pulled out the fact that the word drunk, when people use it in conversation, mainly occurs alongside the various sort of combinations of too, so, or very drunk. when people say drunk, they're talking about the time they got drunk and it was bad. But by contrast, the drunkonyms, those words ending in ed, often occur with intensifiers like completely or totally, I was totally blasted or completely loaded or whatever. And it's by way of creating a humorous situation that in some ways may or may not have gone wrong. And so it's kind of a way of Brits particularly, but I think it extends across the English language these days, around the world, that people try to explain away the bad things that have happened when they drank too much alcohol, and they try to find a sort of gallows or black humour in things that they may have done that they might now regret.
And it seems very vibrant, Harriet, this culture, despite the fact we've talked about this before, younger people drink less than their older predecessors. You have people from different religious backgrounds who don't drink at all in the UK now, more than they used to be. And yet we still have this common joke around drinking too much.
Yeah, I think it's really worth saying that although we've had just an absolute deluge of features in papers and magazines over the past few years about the rise of sober curious and, Gen Z so abstemious and, we're so health conscious, la 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 la, it's incredibly misrepresentative, because actually they might be drinking less than their older counterparts, but they are still drinking significantly more than their European counterparts. Like, it's actually astonishing. I think the difference is, like, when younger people are saying, we drink so much less, we're so health conscious, we're so sober curious, we only drink once a week. Actually, that is still compared with Europe.
Yeah.
It's a lot. Like,
still going out for a drink. Yeah.
And they always seem to just feature a particular type of young person as very health conscious, or perhaps dealing with anxiety or work insecurity or poverty because it's very expensive to drink. But actually, let's be clear. Like, although I really enjoyed this story and the study, and I do think that there's just a lot of humor coming out of it, the study authors did specifically say that using these words allowed British people to discuss drinking to cover up the negative consequences in a light-hearted way. I mean, the statistics are absolutely eye-watering about how much alcohol UK adults consume. 71% of UK adults drink at least once a week, compared with 30% of Europeans. Only, like, we talk about, Gen Z aren't drinking, but actually only 12% of adults in the UK say they're teetotal, compared with 26% in the EU average. So that these statistics aren't even getting across the actual how normalized binge drinking is. I mean, a study last May, which really kind of stuck out last year, I think, and really went underreported, showed that alcohol-related deaths have risen in the UK nearly 90% over 2 decades. So actually dying from alcohol consumption, I mean, that's taking problem drinking and binge drinking and addiction to a fatal place. And that 90% over past 2 decades, despite poverty and anxiety and health consciousness and exercise, that's quite astonishing.
And maybe in a soft way, Cindy actually drags in different demographic groups who wouldn't be drinking so much to excess as well, because this language is very inclusive, isn't it? Everyone sort of understands what it means. But I don't know if you've seen the Daily Mirror's campaign around this. For example, young women dying from alcohol poisoning in the UK is a real problem compared to other nations. I'm not saying it's because people use funny words, but I mean, it does destigmatise the idea that people who perhaps wouldn't have been standing on the street with a pint in their hands maybe now don't feel any stigma about that.
Yeah, I think so. I think the word drunk, if you say, I got really drunk last night, that sounds very serious. Compared to if you say, I got totally sloshed last night, people don't really say in English use in the UK, at least, that, one gets drunk. So I think that is definitely right. And, when Harriet was talking, I was just wondering if it's something to do with weather, I mean, as we record today, it's pissing it down out there. And maybe people need to. I was talking about the February pub standing outside with a pint. Maybe we need that. Maybe that's what we need. Maybe if the weather was nicer, then we wouldn't drink as much.
So if it was about the weather, we'd be drinking inside, not on the street, outside in February. And I'm sure that, like, Scandinavian countries have worse weather than we do.
Well, I think, Arion, as our Australian correspondent, you can debunk that one for us, can't you? I mean, it's pretty warm there most of the time. You have a fairly lively drinking culture there too, no?
I can, and particularly because of the number of Australian words for drunk. Because, for example, Australians might get on the grog or hit the grog, but there's many other things that we might hit or get. For example, you might hit the piss or the terps, short for turpentine.
Oh, I like that one.
You might get on the tiger or get a black dog up ya. And the result of all this hitting and getting is to be full drunk, but there's a list of an even longer list of the things that you might be full of. For example, you might be full as a bull, full as a footy final, or, with my apologies actually for this one, you might be full as a pommy complaint box.
Okay, well on that I think I am full as a bull. I'm going to go out tonight and get completely euphemized. My thanks to Harriet, Arion and Cindy. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week,